Okay, so let's unpack this. There's this conversation happening pretty much everywhere right now that you've probably heard.
Yeah, you might even be living it.
Exactly. It's all about the youngest generation, making waves in the workforce, Gen Z, and the labels are definitely out there.
Oh, yeah. Lazy, entitled, maybe can't disconnect from their phones.
Right, or don't want to work hard. That one comes up a lot.
And often this whole conversation sort of positions them as just fundamentally different, maybe even like problematic compared to how work used to be.
But is that fair? Are these perceptions actually accurate?
Or are we maybe looking at a necessary shift, perhaps even an overdue one, in what work actually means and how it fits into life?
Exactly. And that's really our mission for this deep dive. We've gathered, well, quite a stack of source material, recent articles, some pretty comprehensive surveys.
And crucially, direct perspectives from Gen Z workers themselves, which is so important.
It really is. So our goal here is to try and cut through all that noise, find the facts, maybe separate some myths from reality.
And really get a handle on what truly motivates Gen Z in their careers. What are they really looking for in a workplace?
Yeah. And understanding this is becoming, well, pretty critical for you, honestly, no matter what generation you're in or what your role is.
For sure. Whether you're managing teams or you're working alongside Gen Z colleagues, or maybe you're just curious about where your own profession is headed, their perspective is shaping that future.
Definitely. I mean, the numbers show it. There are nearly a fifth of the U.S. labor force already as of mid-2024.
And projected to be over a quarter, 27% of the global workforce by next year. So, yeah, their presence is significant, and it's only growing.
So let's dive straight into what these sources are telling us. And I think we kind of have to start by tackling those stereotypes head on, because they are definitely showing up in the material we looked at.
Absolutely. You can almost list them off, right?
Right.
The idea they're lazy or unprofessional,
Uh-huh.
that their work ethic is only about the paycheck,
Yeah.
that they care less about work overall compared to, say, older generations.
The tech reliance thing comes up too. Like, they lean too heavily on tech and AI.
Right. And the idea they focus too much on mental health, or that they lack loyalty, only want freelance gigs, have short attention spans.
Oh, the list goes on.
And it's not just, water cooler talk.
Mm-hmm.
One survey we saw cited showed a pretty significant chunk. 55% of hiring managers actually believe Gen Z lacks a strong work ethic.
Wow.
That's a powerful perception floating around out there.
It is, and the sources definitely acknowledge that perception exists, but then they immediately pivot to the Gen Z point of view.
And what's striking there?
Well, what comes through is that they aren't necessarily against hard work. The pushback seems to be more against, like, pointless work, or the idea of just grinding away endlessly without seeing real results or getting fair compensation.
That makes sense.
Yeah, many apparently grew up watching older generations burn out, maybe with not much financial security or reward to show for it. And they seem pretty determined to find a different way. It does feel a bit familiar, doesn't it? Haven't we heard versions of these same criticisms about, well, every new generation entering the workforce, millennials got it, Gen X got it?
It's almost a rite of passage, right? The incoming group gets misunderstood by the ones already established.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting here is how the specific data, and especially the direct quotes from Gen Z in these sources, they don't just challenge the stereotypes. They often give us a totally different way to understand their approach.
Okay, let's dig into that. Take the lazy or unprofessional label.
Right.
One source quotes a 26-year-old, Morgan, and she pushes back on this idea that, dressing more casually or questioning some rigid, maybe outdated practices equals being unprofessional.
How does she frame it?
She sees it more as just a shift in expression, in dress codes, acknowledging the world isn't the same as it was 50 years ago. Simple as that.
Okay. And instead of prioritizing, say, FaceTime, or just logging tons of hours for the sake of it, the Gen Z voices in the sources consistently talk about productivity and efficiency. There's Lewis, 23, who talks about wanting to find the most efficient way to get results using the modern tools they have.
So it's about working smarter, not just harder in the traditional sense.
Exactly. Leveraging what's available now rather than just sticking to old methods that might not even be that efficient anymore.
And the data seems to support a drive for competence, too. Like, 65% of Gen Z say they're eager to master new skills.
Right. So the desire to be effective, to be skilled, it's definitely there. It just might not look like rigidly following all the old workplace norms.
What about things like quiet quitting? That often gets painted as laziness.
Yeah, but the sources frame it quite differently. Not necessarily as just checking out, but more as a response, a response to maybe toxic environments or unrealistic demands for unpaid overtime, or vague expectations with no clear reward.
So more like setting boundaries.
Kind of. It's presented more as setting healthy boundaries in a work situation that hasn't always encouraged that. Doing the job you're paid for, but not necessarily killing yourself, going above and beyond without a clear reason or incentive.
Okay, let's tackle the big one. The idea that their work ethic is only tied to wages.
Ah, yes. This point comes through so strongly in the sources, and it seems largely tied to the economic reality Gen Z is dealing with.
How so?
There's a really stark comparison from David, 23. He mentions his grandparents could afford a house on a pretty minimal income back in the day, whereas he's struggling just with rent, even holding down a job and a side hustle on what looks like a much higher wage today, nominally speaking.
That context is absolutely crucial, and the data really confirms it. We saw stats like 61% of young Americans reporting financial stress.
And the main culprits. Cost of living, that was huge, like 76%, and job instability, around 48%.
And almost half, 49% of Gen Z workers are living paycheck to paycheck.
Exactly. So when the sources talk about Gen Z linking work ethic to wages, it's not necessarily presented as greed or like they don't want to contribute. It seems much more like a pragmatic response.
A response to what?
To a system where just working hard or even working extra hours often still doesn't buy you basic financial security because costs have gone up so much.
Right.
Ben, who's 23, talks about feeling undervalued when wages don't seem to reflect the skills they bring or the increased efficiency that technology demands now. Morgan makes a similar point, too.
So if that traditional link, work hard, get ahead, have a stable life, if that feels broken to them because they've seen it happen to others or are living it,
Then why wouldn't fair compensation be a top priority?
yeah, it seems less like caring only about money and more about needing money to actually live, especially when basics are a struggle even when you have a job.
And this ties right into that other stereotype.
Yeah.
The Gen Z cares less about work overall.
How does that connect?
Well, the sources mention trends like task masking, which is basically like doing focused work discreetly, maybe when forced back into the office, rather than just making a show of being busy.
Kind of challenging the idea that just being seen working means you care.
Exactly. It questions whether face time equals productivity or commitment. And one study did find Gen Z scores lowest when asked about putting work at the absolute center of their lives.
Okay, but how do the sources suggest we interpret that?
They really encourage reframing it. Maybe it's not caring less about work, but caring more about other things, like friends, family, personal well-being. These consistently rank higher for them than their jobs.
Their job isn't their entire identity.
Precisely. And Morgan, the 26-year-old quoted earlier, she connects this perspective really powerfully to the turbulent world they grew up in.
You mean like societal issues?
Yeah, think about it. Gun violence, political polarization, economic uncertainty, health crises. She suggests that in a world that feels unstable, where a job might barely cover basic needs anyway, dedicating your whole life to an AI might seem less logical than investing in personal relationships and well-being.
That puts a different spin on it.
It does, and it doesn't mean they lack drive. Not at all.
Right.
Get this, 86% of Gen Z say having a sense of purpose is vital for job satisfaction.
So they do want meaning from work.
Absolutely. Lewis points out their drive might just be channeled differently, maybe towards entrepreneurship or passion projects or roles with a really clear mission, rather than just climbing the traditional corporate ladder. They seem to reject working just for a paycheck if the work feels meaningless or harms their life outside of it.
Okay, what about their relationship with technology and AI? They grew up with it, right? So digital natives.
Totally. And the sources show they're comfortable using it.
Right.
Like 64% use AI, mostly for things like brainstorming or proofreading, streamlining tasks. Lewis describes tech as a tool for efficiency, something that's propelling the future.
But is it just blind acceptance?
Interestingly, no. The sources also show a healthy dose of caution. Only 48% think Gen AI will actually improve their work, and a pretty big chunk, 59%, worry it could eliminate jobs.
So they see both sides.
Yeah, and David adds that while they use these tools, they get that AI isn't a substitute for fundamental skills or, the wisdom that comes from veteran employees' experience.
So it's more strategic leverage than just passive reliance. And their fluency probably pushes companies to modernize faster.
Definitely. Now, what about the perception that Gen Z focuses too much on mental health?
Right, that comes up. How did the sources handle that?
They generally frame it not as excessive, but as necessary. especially given the high stress levels reported. 40% say they're stressed most or all of the time.
And what's driving that stress?
Mostly financial worries, concerns about family welfare, and work itself.
Morgan, who we mentioned, she suggests prioritizing mental health is seen as something kind of within their control, especially when the wider world feels turbulent and unpredictable.
That makes sense. It's something they can focus on.
Exactly. And they seem less willing to just buy into that older idea that you show unquestioning loyalty to a job, tough it out no matter what, and eventually you'll be rewarded, especially if the job is damaging their well-being.
Is that where things like Bare Minimum Monday come in?
That's one example mentioned, yeah. And it's framed not necessarily as slacking off, but as a strategy, a way to proactively manage stress and prevent burnout by easing into the week.
So sustainability over intensity.
Kind of. Sustaining energy for the long haul rather than sprinting and crashing.
Yeah.
And they seem much more aware of, and frankly less tolerant of, toxic or mentally draining workplaces.
The stats back that up.
Yeah, 57% say they'd quit a job if it negatively impacted their mental health. Though Ben does add a dose of reality, he notes that while they might be quicker to leave a toxic place, finding a replacement job isn't always easy right now.
Fair enough. But that openness about mental health and making it a priority in the workplace, that's a big shift from older norms where you were just expected to suck it up.
Absolutely. So, okay, if we put all this together, if these are the realities kind of bubbling under the stereotypes, what is it that Gen Z workers truly seem to want? What do companies need to get right to attract and keep them?
Well, the sources point to several key things that are really reshaping expectations. First off, career advancement and skill development. That's huge for them.
Like top priority.
Seems like it. 86% prioritize gaining new skills. There's this feeling maybe that traditional education didn't fully prep them, so they really want employers to invest in their growth, provide clear paths forward.
And if they don't get that?
Well, 56% report they'd actually quit if their ambitions aren't supported. So it's serious.
Wow. Okay, what else?
Right behind that is the demand for flexible schedules and, importantly, genuine work-life balance.
Not just lip service?
Exactly. It's not seen as just a nice-to-have perk. It feels more like a necessity. 70% are more likely to apply for jobs that offer flexibility. They're advocating for things like 4-day work weeks.
And focusing on results, not just hours clocked.
Precisely. Productivity is about what you achieve, not how long you sit at a desk. For them, work needs to fit into a fulfilling life. 78% say a sustainable work-life balance is key to their career success. They're actively pushing back against that old 9-to-5 hustle culture.
Makes sense. And financial security, obviously, given what we discussed earlier.
Well, fundamental. They need and expect fair pay. Pay that actually reflects the real cost of living today, and also the increased productivity demands that come with using technology.
High starting salaries must be appealing then.
Hugely. 72% say they're more likely to apply for jobs offering them. They seem really determined to break that cycle they've seen, working hard but not achieving financial stability.
Okay, so skills, flexibility, fair pay. What else?
A positive work environment and real employer support for well-being. They just won't stick around in miserable jobs.
So companies need to actively work on culture.
Absolutely. Prioritize mental health resources, build a supportive culture, tackle toxicity directly. It's not just about making people happy. The sources suggest it links directly to better performance and is critical for keeping people.
And finally,
aligned values and a sense of purpose. This seems non-negotiable for many. Gen Z is highly socially conscious. They expect the companies they work for to mirror their values on big issues: diversity, equity, inclusion, sustainability, ethics.
And if they don't align?
Get this, 65% say they won't even apply for a job if the company's values don't match theirs. Some have even switched jobs specifically because of climate concerns. Work needs to feel like it contributes to something meaningful. A purpose-driven mission is a really strong pull.
It's really interesting then to maybe compare Gen Z with the generation just before them, millennials. The sources do highlight some similarities.
For sure. Both definitely value flexibility, work-life balance, opportunities to advance. Those are common threads.
But there are differences too, right? Subtle ones maybe?
Yeah, the sources point out some significant, though maybe nuanced differences, particularly in surveys like the one from Deloitte. Gen Z often comes across as more, let's say, assertive in actually demanding change on salary, on career progression.
Compared to millennials who might
focus more on advocating for those changes, perhaps a slightly less confrontational approach sometimes.
And then what about job security versus job hopping?
Well, millennials maybe because they were more directly impacted by the 2008 recession, might prioritize job security just a little bit more. Gen Z seems maybe more comfortable with the idea of moving on if it means better opportunities, better pay, or conditions that really align with their priorities.
Interesting. Any other potential differences in mindset?
Yeah, there's a suggestion that Gen Z might be slightly more competitive, maybe more focused on individual success and having control over their own careers. Millennials might have placed a bit more emphasis on peer connection and that sense of workplace community.
What about their top concerns? Are they stressed about the same things?
Cost of living is number one for both, definitely. But the data suggests millennials might feel that pinch slightly more intensely, maybe 40% versus 34% for Gen Z, citing it as their top stressor.
And other issues?
Conversely, Gen Z seems slightly more vocal and active in pushing for climate action, 54% versus 48% of millennials are pushing employers on that.
Okay, here's something counterintuitive I saw in the data. When choosing an employer,
Yeah.
millennials are actually more likely than Gen Z to say work-life balance is the top deciding factor. It was like 31% of millennials versus 25% of Gen Z.
Huh. That is interesting. What could that mean?
Maybe Gen Z sees flexibility more as a baseline expectation, like table stakes. Or perhaps they focus on other things initially and then negotiate flexibility once they're in. Hard to say for sure.
Yeah, could be. What about stress levels overall?
Higher for Gen Z, 40% stressed most of the time versus 35% for millennials. And Gen Z feels more squeezed on time. 50% struggle to finish work within standard hours compared to 45% of millennials.
Wow. And does that impact loyalty?
It seems to. Maybe the most telling stat among people who would actually recommend their current workplace.
Okay.
Significantly fewer Gen Z employees, only 29% see themselves staying there long term, compared to 42% of millennials.
That's a big gap. Suggests maybe different thresholds for commitment or just a greater readiness to look elsewhere if things aren't quite right over time.
Yeah. So, okay, we've got all these insights from the sources, Gen Z's priorities, their experiences, how they differ slightly from millennials. What does this all mean for employers? What are the core implications for building effective teams now and, going forward?
Well, the sources definitely point to both potential upsides and some real challenges that come with integrating Gen Z fully.
Let's start with the positives.
Okay. On the plus side, their tech fluency and their demand for efficiency can really push companies to improve management practices, to modernize workflows. Their focus on values like DEI naturally nudges organizations towards more inclusive cultures.
And their desire for skills.
Right, their eagerness for skill development means you've got a workforce that's really primed for investment in training and growth, which is great for any company.
So they're not just passive employees. Their expectations can actually drive positive evolution for the whole workplace.
Exactly. But there are challenges too, of course. Managing those high expectations around compensation and really rapid advancement that requires super clear communication and realistic pathways.
And the stress and burnout potential.
That's a big one. Employers need to be much more proactive about well-being support, about managing workloads effectively. You can't just rely on that old tough it out mentality. It won't fly.
Motivating them might look different too.
Yeah, it might require moving beyond just traditional incentives, really focusing on that sense of purpose, offering genuine flexibility, showing how their work connects to something bigger.
It sounds like it really requires a shift in mindset for some organizations, maybe even a fundamental one.
I think so. And the sources do offer some practical advice on how to engage Gen Z effectively.
Like what?
Leading by example is key. Managers demonstrating the work-life balance and values the company claims to have. Cultivating individual communication, really taking the time to understand their specific needs and goals, not just seeing them as a job function.
And the training piece.
Crucial. Continuously encouraging and providing opportunities for training and development is pretty much non-negotiable, given how focused they are on growth.
So ultimately, it boils down to listening, being adaptable.
Yeah, and recognizing that the old models aren't just being rejected for the sake of it. They're being challenged by a generation shaped by very different experiences and holding different priorities.
So wrapping this up, I think the core finding from our deep dive into all these sources is pretty clear. Gen Z isn't some lazy, entitled monolith defined by negative stereotypes.
Not at all. They seem to be a generation actively trying to reshape the workplace, and they're doing it based on their unique experiences. Growing up in a pretty turbulent world, facing some harsh economic realities.
And prioritizing things like well-being, flexibility, fair pay, purpose, and continuous growth, ways that really do differ significantly from previous generations.
And given their rapidly growing share of the workforce,
Uh-huh.
understanding these priorities, adapting to them, it's not really optional anymore for companies that want to attract and keep the talent they need for the future.
Right. Ignoring these perspectives means potentially missing out on a huge, vital, and growing segment of skilled people.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us with, well, a final thought for you, our listener, to consider. Given everything we've unpacked today about Gen Z's priorities and motivations, how might your own perspective on work need to evolve? Or maybe your approach to leading teams or collaborating with colleagues?
Yeah, are these demands from Gen Z simply a reaction to the specific economic and societal pressures they've faced? Or do they represent something bigger? Maybe a necessary, even positive evolution of workplace norms that could actually end up creating healthier, more sustainable work environments for everyone in the long run. Something to think about.